Thank you very much indeed, Santi Macharo, who is also hosting the event this evening. I'm at the building of the Dante Society of London on this, the 700th anniversary of the death of Dante in 1321. To mark that, to also say a little bit about the Society of London and an exhibition that they have on right now, which I'll show something of shortly. And also, it's a great joy for me personally to launch this new book, Dante's Divine Comedy. And what is even particularly lovely is see a few familiar faces as well as those who are offline, including Susanna Clark, who has been so wonderful and generous in her support of the book. So Susanna, it's lovely to see you. So let me just say something a little bit about the anniversary to kind of get us in the mood, and then I'll show around the room and how the Dante Society of London is celebrating it. And then we'll move into the Divine Comedy itself. Santi is going to read some of the verses in Italian. I'll read an English translation and then make a few remarks. And then towards the end, around maybe 22, quarter to 7, we'll have time for questions and thoughts and comments. And you can put those in the chat. My partner Nick is helping this evening as well. So you can put your comments in the chat and they'll get picked up there. Or when it comes to it, ask them to camera as well. So cast your mind back to the year 1321. And Dante, in the last period of his life, having been in exile from Florence since around 1302, has been traveling around various parts of what we now think of as northern Italy, a series of city-states, staying in various places. And he's ended up in Ravenna. And his last task in this life had been to go to Venice as an envoy for the city of Ravenna. And it seems that on the way back, he caught malaria and he died on this day, maybe yesterday, it might have been the 13th of September, 1321. And his body was brought back to Ravenna and it was buried there. And you can go now to the tomb today, still in Ravenna. I understand that Florence ever since have been in a kind of bidding war to get the body back, but they exiled him at some point anyway in the 14th century, and he found a resting place in Ravenna. A friend of mine happens to be in Ravenna today, actually, Anthony Coles, and he has sent some pictures of the city celebrating today too. So Anthony, if you're joining this meeting, if you're able to, thank you very much indeed for those. So the Divine Comedy was immediately really a huge success. There are many manuscripts that survive from the 14th, 15th, subsequent centuries. Commentaries started very early on as well, particularly one of Dante's sons started writing commentaries, and then there were calls for public readings of it too. A few ecclesiastical authorities tried to push against the tide, the flood of appreciating Dante, and they didn't succeed. And in a way that brings us all the way up to the 21st century and the Dante Society of London. Sante, as I mentioned, runs the society here. And let me just show you now a bit more about where we are and the exhibition which they've got here. You can, if you Google Dante Society of London, you'll find out where it is, just near Baker Street in North London. I'm going to see if I can just switch cameras, and immediately you can see, I hope there, Sante and also Rita, who's joined us in the room. She's doing a bit of filming too. And I hope you can make out this is sort of exhibition space. And here's a good example of the works they got on show to start with. A figurative image there. Dante, of course, inspires 1,000 comic books, and maybe these set of images are picking that up a little bit more. If I go around here, then you'll see another more modern interpretation here. I'll just show you these as tasters. Santi also tells me that if you go online, there's a 3D exhibition display online too, so you can pick these up in another way. Here's another picture here, more of a hellish image, one suspects there. It's been one of my things this 700th anniversary year, how people very quickly pick up on the Inferno, and everyone says, oh yes, we love the Inferno, that makes sense. They feel somewhat happy about the Purgatory because it feels a bit therapeutic, and we're quite into that in the 21st century. But it's very striking how people get nervous when it comes to the Paradiso. And it was actually one of the things which I did when I had completed my manuscript, which was to make sure that it was roughly a third each. I didn't want to have to eat my own words and realize I'd written a whole lot more on the Inferno and the Purgatorio than I had on the Paradiso. And luckily it's turned out about equal amounts, because I feel that it says quite a lot about our times that we say we love hell, but not quite sure what to make of paradise, especially when Dante is quite clear that it's only when you get to paradise that you start to really know what's going on. Inferno is marked by complete confusion, paradise by Purgatorio by clearing confusion, and then the paradise is where it all starts to become clear. Not that the journey is over in paradise, you'll know if you've read it. It's all still to be discovered there, but you know what you're doing by the time you get to paradise, more or less. So that's something of where we are. One part of the celebration of the 700th anniversary. I don't know how you feel about this, but maybe just a moment now we've kind of arrived in our own times. Maybe it's to give thanks for Dante, to pause momentarily, think what it has meant to you, his work or him, what you'd hope it might if you decided that this is going to be the year where you try and get into it a bit more. As Dante travels, particularly through Purgatory, many souls ask for his prayers. You might even want to reach towards that. My sense is Dante's probably already in paradise. He did say that he was, several people tell him that he was going to go to Purgatory and he'd have to spend quite a long time on the terrace of the proud, converting his vainglory into dignity so he could stand before God. And then also quite a long time on the terrace of the lustful. Love had driven his life, and it's a confusing desire to drive you. So it takes a little clarification as well, but I wonder whether he's achieved that by now and is enjoying the delights that Beatrice shows him when he gets to the paradise. So that's something about where we are now. And now let me turn to my book itself, if I may, and then we'll come to having a period where we enjoy the Divine Comedy itself. So the book here, a quick practical stuff straight away. Nick's going to put in the chat immediately where you can find more details about the book. I've put a website page up where you can get lots of details about the book and read something of the introduction. And then also he'll put another link up if you wanted to buy a signed copy, because I'm very grateful to Church House Bookshop and Ords at Church House Bookshop who have organized signed copies of the book. It's one of the nice things about an author of my standing, when every so often you do see a pile of your books. It doesn't happen very often, but I did see a pile earlier on today in Church House Bookshop, which I went in and signed. If you'd like a signed copy, do use the link there that begins CH Bookshop, I think. Nick, I think, has put that in the chat. The book started for me, well, in some ways it started quite a long time ago. Dante first started making sense to me when I was in my own psychotherapy. I work as a psychotherapist for most of my time, and modern psychotherapy is very good at taking you down into the chilly depths, or sometimes the fiery depths of your inner life, and it's quite good at beginning to get a sense that there's more to life, a bit as Dante does as he starts to climb Mount Purgatory. But it was very timely for me that with the Temenos Academy here in London and a brilliant leader of that group, Jeremy Nagler, we slowly and steadily went through the Divine Comedy under his guidance in a group of about a dozen. And it spoke to me like it had never spoken before, and was very timely to me. It started making huge amounts of sense as a kind of mirror of my own experience in some small measure, but also a map as to what I might hope for, where it might point me to, actually. And ever since that time, I've read the Divine Comedy, about once a year. And then last year, in 2020, I decided I wanted to read it again. But this time to start putting up some podcasts, partly as a discipline, just to help me commit to making some sense of each canto. And so did that. And then, of course, COVID struck. And so it became quite a lockdown exercise discipline for me. Over 100 podcasts, which are on YouTube or a podcast feed near you, putting something up to try and make sense of each canto. I would basically sit down on a Saturday morning, and with the freedom that life without children it gives you, and try and work out what on earth was going on in the next canto, and then have something to say about it. And then at some point, people started, sending very kind emails saying they were appreciating what that was about. And then someone said, maybe it's a book. And I felt rather daunted, because it's one thing to sprout happily to camera. It's another to put words on the page and then have to read them again later. But anyway, it became a book. And I then realized, of course, that there was this anniversary coming up. And so was delighted and very grateful quickly to find Angelico Press, who are a small publisher of religious books in the US, but with a good reputation and some very fine publishers, some very fine authors, actually. If any of you have ever read David Bentley Hart, the brilliant and fiery and very lucid theologian who writes a lot now, his latest book, Roland in Moonlight, is published by Angelico Press. And John Rees, the publisher there, picked up the book very quickly, which was great because we needed to turn it around if we were going to get it out for now. He was particularly interested, actually, in my interest in Owen Barfield, one of the Inklings, the Inkling not quite so famous as C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, but Barfield was a key interlocutor for me as I was trying to make sense of the Divine Comedy, along with the fourth Inkling, who is fairly well known to, Charles Williams, who wrote about the Divine Comedy in relation to his romantic theology. And so John from Angelico Press was drawn to that prism through which to try to understand these things. And it was lovely for me when he said, yep, we're going to go for it. And they produced the book really beautifully. It's got this very fiery cover with a Botticelli image of Beatrice showing Dante the next stage up to the next heaven. And then the book also has 100 illustrations in it. One of the good things about writing about Dante is that the best illustrations are all out of copyright. William Blake's, Gustave Doré's, the medieval ones by figures like Giovanni di Paolo, and others, Botticelli, of course. So each canto is presented in this way. And the book is both a narrative retelling and also is what you need to understand the canto, as I perceived it anyway, and then thoughts and comments and a kind of application for now. Because of this business of taking very seriously what Dante said, that he felt charged by heaven to communicate how others too can know of divine reality, of spiritual reality, in a time like ours where that was not automatic or taken for granted at all. He is the first to use the word modern in Italian and realized that the Florence of the 14th century, in this period that's sometimes called now the First Industrial Revolution, because of the development of banking, because of the emergence of mercantilism, people's sense of life and therefore of themselves was changing very, very dramatically. And so whilst at one level, the Divine Comedy was born of his exile, at another level, it was also born of a time where he felt exile was becoming a cultural phenomenon. Alienation from divine life was beginning to creep in, whether it be because of the excesses of the church or because of secular life as well. And he lived in this extraordinary time, actually. You know, the Franciscans had got going the century before, the Beguines, this remarkable movement of women across Europe, which I think is becoming clearer and clearer even now how profound and important it was. Tens of thousands of women across Europe claiming a kind of independence, both of the church and of secular expectation, to know the divine in this very direct way that Dante was also pioneering. So that's something about how my book came to be and what I hope it might help with to find a way into this labyrinth or to spark new thoughts, because it's one of these books that is inspired, which means that you want to read it again and again, and it channels more and more as you do that. So now let's turn to the Divine Comedy itself. And we've got a real treat, I hope, to bring some of the magic, not just of the commentary and the explanations, but of the Italian itself. Santi actually knows about 1,000 lines of the Divine Comedy by heart. I have a neighbor actually in South London, Ellie, who had to do Dante at school. And when I told her that I was writing a book about the Divine Comedy, she looked at me like I was slightly mad. She had, I think, the experience which some of us in the English-speaking world might have about being forced to read King Lear when we're 13 and wondering what on earth it was about and why it could possibly ever be celebrated. So I've been trying to persuade her ever since that there's something in this book. But Sante doesn't need any persuading at all. He has memorized 1,000 lines. And we're going to read in Italian and then in English. And then I'll make a few comments about a section from the Inferno, a section from the Purgatorio, and a section from the Paradiso for the next 20 minutes or so. So we're going to start at the beginning in the Inferno. And Dante wakes up, as you will no doubt know, in a dark wood, his life clearly falling apart. And this is how he introduces the start of the Divine Comedy in Italian. Santi, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So I'm going to recite the verses only in Italian. No worry, I won't recite that in English. So the first canto from the Inferno. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura che la dritta via era smarrita. Ahi, quanto a dir qual era e cosa dura è sta selva selvaggia e aspra e forte che nel pensiero rinnova la paura, tant'è amara che poco più è morte. Ma per trattar del ben chi vi trovai, dirò dell'altre cose chi vo scorte. Io non so ben ridir come vi entrai, tante era pien di sonno a quel punto che la verace via abbandonai, ma poi chi fui al piede un colle giunto là dove terminava quella valle che m'avea di paura il cor compunto, guardai in alto e vidi le sue spalle vestite già dei raggi del pianeta che mena dritto altrui per ogni canto. Allor fu la paura un poco queta che nel lago del cor m'era durata la notte, chi passai con tanta pietà.
Thank you.
Grazie.
I hope you just get a little of the terza rima there, this famous A, B, A, B, C, B pattern that has this propulsive effect. Now, I'm going to read those lines in English in Mark Muse's translation, which I have found so helpful because it goes for the clarity to try to unpack things. So here are the lines that Santi just read in an English translation. Midway along the journey of our life, I woke to find myself in a dark wood, for I had wandered off from the straight path how hard it is to tell what it was like, this wood of wilderness, savage and stubborn. The thought of it brings back all my old fears. A bitter place. Death could scarcely be bitterer. But if I would show the good that came with it, I must talk about things other than the good. How I entered there, I cannot tell. I had become so sleepy at the moment when I first strayed, leaving the path of truth. But when I found myself at the foot of a hill, at the edge of the wood's beginning, down in the valley, where I first felt my heart plunged deep in fear, I raised my head and saw the hilltop shawled in morning rays of light, sent from the planet that leads men straight ahead on every road. And then, if you'll indulge me, I'll just read a few paragraphs from my own book and how I begin to unpack this opening section. Dante's The Divine Comedy begins with famous words. Halfway through the journey of life, he wakes up. He is in a dark wood, having wandered from the path. We have begun. The year is 1300. The day is Good Friday. Dante is 35 years old, at the midpoint of his 70 years and 10. He is already a famous poet and politician. He is married, a father, and has been in love. However, fortune has turned against him. Florence is being ruined by a civil war between the groups known as the Guelphs and Ghibellines. Dante has found himself on the wrong side, with the faction known as the White Guelphs. He is soon to be expelled from his beloved city on pain of being burnt alive. What is life really about? He is midway through it and finds himself far from the path that he thought was navigable. The dark wood is confusing and bitter, as is his life. Both fill him with fear. Has everything that he stood for been lost? He had thought he was a success and is wondering if he has been simply and thoroughly deluded. The journey beginning is of far greater significance than he could have possibly imagined. It will be an odyssey full of strange encounters in a cosmos that is far odder than it has so far seemed. It will be labyrinthine, in the sense that although full of twists and turns, and often seeming to take him away from the center, there will prove to be no wrong turnings, no matter how dark and difficult it gets. This journey is willed and held by barely imaginable forces. You perhaps will notice that at the end of the lines that Santi read, and that I read that in English, Dante sees the sun, the planet that, if we know and can see, can never ultimately lead us astray, because it reflects the divine light. And at the beginning of Canto 1, Dante thinks, oh, I've just woken up and it's a bad day, but there's the sun. I can follow that and all will be fine. But it turns out that that is not the case. And he must go through the gates of hell to the place where there isn't any good, in order to find out just how much good there is in the cosmos. So that's how the Divine Comedy begins. And we're now going to turn to a section in the Purgatorio. In fact, it's the midpoint of the Divine Comedy. And one little thing that you can listen for is the word love, the word amor, which occurs precisely at the midpoint of the 14 or 15,000 lines of the Divine Comedy. It's a bit more of a technical section, this. Remember that Dante now has journeyed all the way to the floor of hell with these huge reveals that the floor is frozen solid. It's not fiery, in fact. It's so cold that it's almost falling out of being itself. If it had got any further from God, it would have just disappeared. But it's still just within the divine presence, which Dante shows in another very remarkable way, that the way out of hell is actually on the body of Lucifer, the angel of light. One of the things which I try and explore is how the Divine Comedy, I think, actually shows that Christianity is a universal religion. All will be saved, I think Dante is saying by the end. But you can only really understand that and have that alongside the terrible things that happen in life by journeying to the floor of hell with him. So he's done that, and with Virgil, his guide, they've begun their climb up Mount Purgatory. And we're going to turn now to Canto 17 of the Purgatorio, and the central point, which reflects on love, the central theme, along with the intellect of the Divine Comedy. And so Dante is going to read a few lines now from Canto 17, and listen out for Amor and love.
With pleasure. So this part I can't by heart. Or perché mai non può dalla salute amor del suo subbietto volger viso, dall'odio proprio son le cose tute. E perché intender non si può diviso, e per sé stante alcuno esser dal primo, da quello odiare ogni effetto è deciso. Resta, se dividendo benestimo, che il mal che s'ama è del prossimo, ed esso, amor, nasce in tre modi in vostro limo. E chi per esser suo vicin soppresso spera eccellenza il sol per questo brama, che sia di sua grandezza in basso messo. E chi podere, grazia, onore e fama teme di perder per ch'altri sormonti, onde s'attrista sì che il contrario ama. Ed è chi per ingiuria par caonti sì che si fa della vendetta ghiotto, e tal convien che il male altrui impronti. Questo triforme amor qua giù di sotto si piange.
Hope you heard Amor there right at the end. Here's the English translation of this section, and then I'll just make a few comments on it. It's a bit more complicated. This gives you a sense of how Dante is in conversation both with Virgil and then Beatrice, thinking about this journey as well. It's not just something that happens to him in gloomy depths and peak experiences. You know, we're not just puppets being pulled back to the divine. We have to will it in our freedom consciously to enter into divine life, Dante says. And here's a key section where they think about one inflection of love. Here it is in English. Now, since it is a fact that love cannot ignore the welfare of its loving self, there's nothing in the world can hate itself. And since no being can be conceived as being all in itself, severed from the first being, no creature has the power to hate his God. And so it follows, if I argue well, the evil that man loves must be his neighbor's. This love springs up in three ways in mortal clay. There is the man who sees his own success connected to his neighbor's downfall. Thus, he longs to see him fall from eminence. Next, he who fears to lose honor and fame, power and favor if his neighbor rise, vexed by his good, he wishes for the worst. Finally, he who wronged flares up in rage with his great passion for revenge. He thinks only of how to harm his fellow man. This threefold love is purged by those below. So this is one of Dante's big claims. It's actually a claim familiar in the Neoplatonic tradition. Socrates had said something as much, which is essentially, there isn't actually evil in the world in the sense of evil being a center of power and destruction and hate and violence with its own autonomy. Evil actually is always a derivative of ignorance, of not knowing what life is about. Now, it can build to very great extents, as we in the 20th, 21st century know quite as much as Dante in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. But this is part of the clarity that the journey up Mount Purgatory starts to show Dante, that he can make these bolder and bolder claims because he has been below. He has brought the light of understanding to the depths of depravity. And so in these lines, he says, there's nothing in the world can hate itself. It's only mistaken love that leads to what we call hate and envy and jealousy. And similarly, we can't ever fully become uncoupled from the divine love, therefore. I think of it like this, that if we did, we would just fall out of life altogether. We can make mistakes, and we do, but ultimately nothing can let us go from that divine love. But then this is part of the nuance here, that even in failed forms of love, Dante says it still reflects the divine love in perverse ways. And so he explains how fallen love has a threefold nature, much as he understands the divine love to have a threefold nature in the person of the Trinity. So there's some kinds of love that hate a neighbor's success. There's other kinds of love that feel they can only rise if others fall. And then there's a third kind of love that feel they can only rise if they take out their opponents. And this psychology which develops, that's very powerful, very penetrating as a model. Even perverse forms of love, Dante says, mirror the divine love. And that's what the souls in purgatory are starting to discover when they start to understand what's really going on, see through it, drawn by love, understand their mistakes and how they've been led astray, but realizing they've actually never been let go in that, which is why purgatory is a place of pain, but it's always a place of hope, unlike the Inferno, where people have forgotten that love can never let them go. So we've touched on the midpoint of the Divine Comedy in this lovely literary moment where the word love pivots the whole 15,000 lines, reflecting on the ambivalent state of love in our lives, in this ambivalent place called Mount Purgatory, where people are rising and seeing more and more clearly. And now we're going to move to the last part of the Divine Comedy. You'll know that at the top of Mount Purgatory, Dante enters Eden, and there he meets Beatrice. I think she can only join him then, because if she joined him before, he would have been blasted by the sight. He wouldn't have been able to take it in. It would have been like a wild psychedelic trip that he just couldn't make any sense of, and so maybe remembered and wished would return, but couldn't grow into and grow with, and so expand into the divine life. But Beatrice meets him at the top of Mount Purgatory in Eden. It's quite a meeting in itself, which I'll leave you to discover if you don't know about it already. But they begin the transhumanizing process, where the human self-contained sense opens up, and Dante starts to realize that being human actually is about being able to receive the boundless life of the divine without limit. That's what he means by transhumanizing, not like some people mean now, just sort of extending the dreary round of life indefinitely on a computer, if not in a fleshly body. This is about discovering more and more and more, and eventually rising through the seven heavens, entering the prima mobile, and then finally the empyrean, where time and space itself gives way to the divine life. Dante comes to the culminating vision of the Divine Comedy. And so Dante now is going to recite, I think, some of his favorite verses, which conclude Canto 33, the 100th canto of the Divine Comedy as a whole, and Canto 33 of the Paradiso. And particularly listen to the verse now and its ecstatic, beautiful, and tremendous qualities. Dante.
Grazie. O luce eterna, che sola in te sidi, sola ti intendi e da te intelletta intendente te ami e arrivi. Quella circolazione che sì concetta pareva in te come lume riflesso dagli occhi miei alquanto circunspetta, dentro da sé del suo colore stesso mi parve tinta della nostra effigie, perché il mio viso in lei tutto era messo. Qual è il geometra che tutto s'affigge per misurarlo cerchio e non ritrova pensando quel principio ond'ell'indige, tale era io a quella vista nova, veder voleva come si convenne l'imago al cerchio e come vi s'indova, ma non eran da ciò le proprie penne, se non che la mia mente fu percossa da un fulgore in che sua voglia venne. All'alta fantasia qui manco possa, ma già volgeva il mio disio e il velle, sì come rota che ugualmente è mossa l'amor che muove il sole e l'altre stelle.
Thank you. Apart from the us, maybe you noticed the last word there, stelle, stars, which is the word that ends the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso. The stars can ultimately never let us go. And I'll read out the English version. I'm tempted to actually ask Dante to recite that again because it's so wonderful after I've read the English version, and then maybe you'll hear a little bit more if, like me, your Italian is deeply flaky. So here's the translation by Mark Muser again of the last tercets of the Divine Comedy. O light eternal, fixed in self alone, know only to yourself, and knowing self, you love and glow, knowing and being known. That circling, which, as I conceived it, shone in you as your own first reflected light when I had looked deep into it a while, seemed in itself and in its own self-color to be depicted with man's very image. My eyes were totally absorbed in it. As the geometer who tries so hard to square the circle but cannot discover, think as he may, the principle involved, so did I strive with this new mystery. I yearned to know, how could our image fit into that circle? How could it conform? But my own wings could not take me so high. Then a great flash of understanding struck my mind, and suddenly its wish was granted. At this point, power failed high fantasy, but like a wheel in perfect balance turning, I felt my will and my desire impelled by the love that moves the sun and the other stars. Dante, Sante, let's hear that again in the original words of Dante.
O luce eterna, che sola in te sidi, sola t'intendi e da te intelletta intendente te ami e arrivi. Quella circolazione che sì concetta pareva in te come lume riflesso dagli occhi miei alquanto circunspetta dentro da sé del suo colore stesso, mi parve tinta della nostra effigie perché il mio viso e lei tutto era messo. Qual è il geometra che tutto s'affigge per misurarlo cerchio e non ritrova pensando quel principio ond'ell'indige? Tale era io a quella vista nova, veder voleva come si convenne l'imago al cerchio e come vi s'indova, ma non eran da ciò le proprie penne, se non che la mia mente fu percossa da un fulgore in che sua voglia venne. All'alta fantasia qui mancò possa, ma già volgeva il mio disio e il velle, sì come rota che ugualmente è mossa, l'amor che muove il sole e l'altre stelle. Grazie, Mark.
Thank you, Santi. That was tremendous. Hello, I'm just going to read how I conclude my book, if you'll give me that indulgence. And then we'll come to some questions and comments, which I hope there will be. Do place them in the chat, as Nick's been saying, or when we come to it, ask people to join in as well. But here's how I riff finally on those last few tercets. He sees the eternal light is a self that is completely contained, without outside, simultaneously containing itself. It is known, knowing, and knower. It encircles itself, reflects itself, dives into itself. And then he sees something further. Within God is the presence of humanity. He sees himself in the light. It is the origin of the sense that within us is a divine spark or flame, which is our very life. It would be called non-dual consciousness today, uncoupled from identification with transient experiences and returning to the first or primary experiencing. The presence of God is known as a steady presence containing the human mind. My eye and God's eye is one eye and one sight and one knowledge and one love, Dante's contemporary Meister Eckhart remarked. Dante perceives the divine I am, that is the condition of possibility for the multitude of shining I ams that walked the streets of Renaissance Florence and walk upon the earth today. Dante knows himself to be within divine life. He sees it. For all that it appears impossible, he references trying to square circles, allowing himself a few final lines of failure that hope to transmit finally, fully seeing it all. A prodigious flash of insight strikes him and the wish is granted. He knows himself to be spinning like a perfectly balanced wheel. He shares the truth of being, which is his being. God was his love all along, not the object of it, there being no objects in God. His intelligence and sight are the intelligence and sight of God. He moves as the love that moves the sun and the other stars. And his extraordinary poem ends. The ceasing of words is its completion. To say more would distract from the truth. Our life and God's life is one life. It's a long way from the dark wood, but it's also perhaps not such a long way from the dark wood when you get to the end of it. But look, thank you so much for listening and sharing this. Thanks, Dante, again. And maybe we'll have some thoughts and comments. Nick, how's that been looking?
Well, there's been a couple of comments from Susanna Clark and also from Vittoria Martino. And I think we're going to start with Pippa Evans's question. Here's her question. I don't know if Mark has touched on this earlier, but I'd love to know when he first felt the pang of love for Dante.
I think that I felt it before I really even knew how to respond to it, in the sense that I've been, very interested in Christian ideas, theology, the spiritual traditions particularly, and knew that the Divine Comedy was at the pinnacle of all these writings in the West. But I guess I tried to read it a handful of times in the past, couldn't get into it. But it was with my own psychotherapy and then this reading group with the Temenos Academy that finally I started to be able to feel it, I guess, as well as read it. So the pang of love was this sense of a sort of vacuum that I felt needed to be filled, I guess, that gradually I found a way into, or at least I should say maybe grace met me and led me into it. Thank you, Pippa.
So there's a couple of questions from Susanna Clark. I wonder, Susanna, would you like to ask your questions? There's one particularly to the Italians amongst us. What, Susanna?
I wondered if the Italians could tell us something about how Dante is regarded in Italy now. The English and the British know how Shakespeare is regarded by some people as this sort of very dry thing, or this sort of ordeal they have to go through in school, and by other people as this sort of wonderful living person. So that would be great. If you could just tell us.
In my school, can I read now? Can I speak now? So at my time, a long time ago, when I was 15, I learned Dante in the school, but to be honest, I didn't learn anything about him. And my passion on Dante was born later. I was an adult, 25, thanks to Benigni, Roberto Benigni, who recited and who explained Dante on this square in front of Santa Croce in Florence. And then I was so touched by Benigni's interpretation of Dante that I began to read. And then I wanted to discover the source of Dante. And then I began a trip that I think I won't never end. No, it's not typical. It's no. In the school, normally in Italy you learn Dante Alighieri, the Divine Comedy, but perhaps I was unlucky. I didn't have a good teacher. Just that. But later I had the greatest inspiration you can have.
And Mark, we have somebody called Owen Barfield, who I know you know, and he's got his hand up, as it were, in the chat. And I wonder if Owen, would you like to talk to Mark?
Yes, yes, please, and thanks for the invitation. I just wanted to say that I was there at the last book launch that Mark did, and it doesn't seem that long ago. So I'm absolutely amazed at Mark's ability to produce books and do research, and well done. And I feel there's a real direct continuation between that book launch and this book launch. I sort of feel I'm a part of it, and I really enjoy being a part of it. And I like the way Mark there referred to the Inklings, and there's an Inklings link, because I was very aware that it's a very important book for Grandfather, that annually he and C.S. Lewis would read it in the original Italian. And I've never really understood why it was so important for the Inklings, but I'm now going to get Mark's book and hopefully be just a little bit more illuminated than I was. And I think this is going to be important, not just for me, but just for a lot of people as well. I think it will help a lot of people, particularly this special time that we're in. And I say special in terms of crisis special. You know, we really do need to get our heads around these subject matters. And I think what Mark's doing is important work in nudging us all towards this way of thinking. So thank you, Mark, very much. And whilst I'm on the line, can I also just say thank you to Susanna Clark, because I know if I tell people that I was at a meeting with Susanna Clark and I didn't thank her for everything that she's doing, you know, I'd probably get slapped around the head or something. So thank you, Susanna. I have read your book. I really appreciate the name check to Grandfather. And in his name, you know, let us share our appreciation to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Owen. And yeah, if you want to go down the Owen Barfield rabbit hole, it will reveal hidden sites and caverns and lead you back up to the light as well, in fact. And Owen, who's just spoken, Owen Barfield's grandson, has a wonderful website with lots of Owen Barfield resources. And indeed, Susanna's book, Piranesi, I feel captures a lot of that as well, as much as all sorts of other things. Yeah, so thank you so much, Owen. It's lovely to see you.
Thanks for that.
Great. There's a question from Joshua Roberts, you probably can see in the chat, asking how much, and I think the answer may be almost entirely, how much you agree with Jeremy Nadler about the Divine Comedy as a visionary text based on mystical experience. I'd like to say something.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Thank you. Yes. And reading it with Jeremy Nadler, as I know you have done as well, shows that, because it so moves you and you feel your perception opening up as a result. I guess that part of what is behind the question is how it's read today. And actually, I just reviewed the new Oxford Handbook of Dante, which has about 45 essays by scholars from the US and Europe on Dante as a whole, actually, to the Vita Nova and other books, as well as the Divine Comedy. And it's quite a tussle implicitly in the book. There are, on the one hand, those inspired by a certain kind of postmodernity, saying this book is, its truth comes from its performance, and it's the genius of the performance that creates the truth. And I was very glad that there are other voices in the book resisting that and saying, no, no, no. You know, as William Blake knew, that if you think vision can be created out of nothing, then all you get is, as Blake put it, the same dull round. You can make the descent into hell, perhaps, in a kind of vicious spiral, but the virtuous spiral back to the source can't be made. And so this tussle, is it visionary or is it just performative? Is it true in the most profound kind of senses? Not literally true, of course, because literal truth flattens and crashes things as well, as Dante discovers in the Inferno. But the metaphorical truth, the symbolic truth, the tropological truth that asks us to change so that we can know more and more of this vision. That is what it's about, and kind of fighting for that almost, I think. Certainly that's quite a motivation for me, because it is a tussle now, how to read the Divine Comedy. And so picking it up in this 700th year is a good time to do it as much as any time. Yeah.
Right, thank you, Mark.
I'm going to, in a moment, ask a question, or Nick's question, Nick Graham is in the chat there. But I wonder if you want to say, Mark, a quick shout out to Ode at the Church House Bookshop. And if you're going to buy the book, then you're encouraging them to do that via Church House Bookshop rather than a certain Amazon. Do you want to say something about that?
Yes, Alder's really good at actually helping out earlier on, getting a website up that people could pre-order the book. There are now books signed there, and they're being sent to the US as well as around the UK and other parts of the world. So do get the link there from the chat which Nick's put in. And it's a joy to share this book launch with you as the last one that Owen Barfield mentioned as well. So thank you so much for that. Do support Church House Bookshop. I'm not completely against Amazon myself, actually, but anyway, let's not go there.
So Nick Graham wants to say, asking about the difference or similarities theologically between Dante and John Milton.
Yeah, now, so this is a question where I think the questioner probably knows more than the person being asked to say something. The person actually I would make the comparison through is William Blake, who engaged deeply both with Milton and with Dante. And it's quite interesting how Blake changes the images to reflect his own take on things, you know, which is wholly appropriate with these texts. Unless you make something of it yourself, you don't go on the journey. And so Blake's discourse, dialogue, even disagreement with Dante and Milton is absolutely crucial, in fact. Just one small detail that I really like is when they're in the Inferno, they come to one of the sort of monstrous mythical figures guarding around, Plutus. And in ancient Greek mythology, he actually was a god who had a cornucopia. His parents were agricultural gods, and they distributed goods from this cornucopia. But in the Divine Comedy in the Inferno, this has obviously gone wrong. The goods, I think Dante is making a comment about usury, trying to make goods from goods, build artificial worlds, if you like. And the way that Blake depicts this is that instead of Plutus having his cornucopia, he has a money bag. And so instead of it being a container for gifts that should be given, it's a container for withholding gifts. And it's a brilliant comment, I think, from William Blake, living a few hundred years after Dante, after Milton, in the age of the dark satanic mills, and how the original vision through Dante, through Milton, is still relevant to us now when we can pick it up and make sense of it in our way. So thank you.
Great, thanks. Pippa is being very playful, asking what Dante would think about Amazon, but you might not want to go there. You might have to do that privately. Unless, do you want to comment?
Pippa's already had one question. Isn't there someone else? That's my avoidance strategy.
Well, it's 2 minutes to 8. There's something Joshua's put a comment there in the chat. Making the devil far too attractive as compared to the frozen devil Dante has.
Well, I just remembered Jeremy Nadler had actually made a comment about that at the Terminos Academy. And yeah, he'd said something like he thought Milton was overplaying the devil too much, and many people come into that, therefore they come out of it really remembering the devil almost as an exclusive part of it.
This is sometimes said, isn't it, that the most interesting character in Milton is Satan.
Right.
Whereas in Dante, Satan is this monstrous fallen angel, a seraphim who is closest to God, an angel of light, and his wings are just about flapping. I think of it as a bit like when you see a decapitated fish on the dockside with its mouth just sort of going, but to no purpose whatsoever anymore. It's a very bleak sight, in fact, but not without hope, strangely, because it's on the body of Lucifer that they turn around.
Yeah, but also he's more frozen, isn't he? He's less active, or so as Milton's devil's, kind of very potent and powerful and active. And yeah, so I just thought I'd mention that Nadler had put that point across at least. Yeah, I
guess I need to say something about Amazon and Dante. I see it's preoccupying people in the chat.
As long as we leave time for Victoria Martineau, because she wants to.
Oh, okay, yes.
Yeah.
Well, look, just to say, usury is a big concern for Dante. He begins to see the effects of making money out of money, and he's horrified. It's actually contemplating usury that he first starts to really understand what's going on in the Inferno. Other sins don't make much sense to him for quite a long time. Well, let's have a final question, but it is a serious issue. That's absolutely right. But Victoria.
Yeah, Victoria Martineau. I wonder, Victoria, would you like to unmute and ask your question? She's asking a question about artists, writers, filmmakers, which also Susanna was asking about. Which ones do you think have really got him right, as it were? But Victoria, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. It's just I'm in California, so I'm not in my evening gown yet. Yeah, well, I'm just very curious because I wish I'd known all of this about your work a long time ago, because tonight I'm starting a lecture series in California on I'm a musician and an art historian, so I'm approaching Dante from the reception by other artists and other media. And so Susanna put a question in the chat for you about artists and writers and filmmakers. And so I put an addendum with composers. And so I'd love to hear what resonates with you particularly, because you've been so immersed in Dante in so many ways. So it would be really interesting for me to hear which of the, in the last 700 years, which of the various artistic interpretations of Dante feel the most resonant with you.
I mean, let me mention, it's a big question, but let me mention one artist who, unfortunately, we couldn't have her images in the book because she's still alive, so they're not out of copyright, but you can find some of them online, and it's the artist Monica Beisner. She lives here in London, and she does these extraordinary, bright, vivid images where she's able to use color to convey the effulgence, particularly of the Paradiso. I think that's one of her great successes, is that that's the hardest to show, I think, because it's becoming preternatural. And yet she manages to do so. If Gustave Doré does it by kind of going Gothic with his great soaring skies, and William Blake was working on them, of course, when he died. And so some of them are complete, and he shows flame and fire and swirling forms in the way that he can using watercolor. Monica Beisner she uses oils, and she's created a wonderful set of images, 100, one for each canto. You can find some of them online, and you can buy books of them as well. And it's something about, she gets the intensity of it across. But there's a playfulness in her figures as well. You know, there's something of the cartoon in it, in the way that cartoon-like images can draw you in more deeply, in fact, to the meaning, because they always already feel kind of multivalent. Then they're real, but never realist, you might say. And yeah, so have a look at, if you, I mean, you maybe you do know Monica's work already. I saw you nodding, but for others, have a look at Monica Bison's work.
No, actually, I don't know her. So thank you so much. I'll definitely look her up. I appreciate that. Well, how do you spell her name as if it were German? B-E-I-S-N-E-R?
It's a K. So so Monica, and then Bisner, B-E-I-S-N-E-R. Yes, that's it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Monica with a K. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
No, that's wonderful. I appreciate that.
That's great. And Andy Wilson's put a link through. Maybe that's, not quite sure what that link is. I can't see the end of that, but there's a link there. And Sante is, I don't know how much more time you've got, Mark.
We should begin to wrap things up, but if there's people who would like to get a final question in, that would still be lovely, and then we'll draw to a close.
Yeah, I'm just kind of having a little look. Certainly, Sante wants to invite everyone to the next Dante talk organised by the Dante Society. And so there's a link to an Eventbrite there, which we'll highlight for you. Let's maybe a last question, if that feel about right. Andrew Brown is really enjoying the Clive James translation. What do you make of it?
Thanks, Andrew. And it's great you raised that, because of course Clive James, as we all discovered with his lengthy exit from this life, was very ambivalent about what it all means, and captures that often in very wonderful poetry, of course. But it always fascinated me that he underwent the effort of translating the Divine Comedy. I think his wife is even a Dante expert, but certainly a medieval Italian expert. But it is true that the Divine Comedy has inspired people that don't necessarily buy into its theological vision. Another person that it greatly inspired, whose name has just completely slipped my mind actually, but the writer of Ulysses, the modernist writer. I see my friend Toby's on the line. He would immediately be able to help with this. But it does inspire all sorts of people. And I guess people can read it for the depths of its humanity as much as for the depths of its divine vision. James Joyce, thank you, Tom, has put in the comment. Yeah, and Clive James found that too. I mean, I would hope that he now knows there's a whole lot more beside, but maybe his style gets something of Dante's verse, because he has a very transparent style that enjoys punning. Dorothy L. Sayers, whose translation is the best-selling English translation ever, her book sold over 1 million copies. She remarks in her introduction that Dante's humor often gets forgotten, and I think that Clive James would get some of that actually. So I hope that chimes with your experience of reading Clive James's translation.
And Jessica was asking about Joshua. Thank you very much. You've answered the question. Jessica was answered. Mark Musa is the translation you're reading from, I think, Mark. Yeah. Yeah,
so it's one of the Penguin Classics. Dorothy L. Sayers is published by Penguin Classics, and then Mark Musa's was actually commissioned after Dorothy L. Sayers, in fact. And I think it stands out very well. It also has a good number of footnotes to help you in. Though, of course, you will need a full commentary and guide. In fact, even a guide for the spiritual journey in order to read the Divine Comedy.
And Sante is saying grazie mille to all of you and to Mark for the beautiful time. I think that's a really, thank you, Sante, if you're still there. You got called Dante I think of one moment by Mark, which is a wonderful, that's not a Freudian slip. What is that, Mark? What do you call that?
It's the truth will out. That's what it is. So look, let's draw things to a close then. Rita and Sante from the Dante Society in London, thank you very much indeed. It's really wonderful to be able to co-host this event and celebrate on this particular evening. Because remember, tonight is the 700th anniversary of the death of Dante and all that he has given us. And I hope that if you did need any persuasion at all, you have been persuaded that whether it be in art or writing or engaging with the literature itself, that the Divine Comedy still speaks very directly to our times. Thank you so much for joining us.